Hello, my name is Nestor de Armas Guerra. I come from the University of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria, and today I'm going to be talking about tracing literary development in graded readers, a comparative corpus-based study of English and Spanish text. First, I would like to thank this Cineco Congress for letting me participate in its fourth edition, of course. Next, I would like to show you an overview of what we will talk about. And finally, an introduction. So, extensive reading has traditionally been regarded as a vital component of second language acquisition, but the consistent decline in students' reading habits underscores the pressing need to reevaluate instructional strategies. Graded readers remain valuable resources, offering learners simplified stories tailored to their language proficiency and encouraging engagement with literature. This study, therefore, explores how literary complexity is gradually developed across various proficiency levels in English and Spanish graded readers. Continuing with the research objectives, I had three main objectives. First, the analysis of literary devices in graded readers. To analyze the use and progression of literary devices such as metaphors, similes, and personification in graded readers written in English and Spanish, using text that align with the CEFR levels A1 and B1 and B2 approximately. Secondly, the examination of frequency and complexity across proficiency levels to assess whether the frequency and sophistication of selected literary techniques increase with the proficiency level, based on our corpus of approximately 60 titles from the Oxford Bookworm series and over 30 from the Instituto Cervantes collections. Thirdly, comparative study between English and Spanish graded readers. To compare how literary elements are introduced and adapted in English and Spanish graded readers, identifying cross-linguistic similarities and differences in the pedagogical use of literary devices. Continuing with the methodology, this study adopts a corpus-based approach, utilizing the Langsbox software to identify and classify occurrences of literary devices within the selected text. The tool supports systematic tracking and analysis of stylistic features across a large body of data. The analysis centers on particular forms of literary expression, including similes, metaphorical language, and figurative personification. Both frequency counts and qualitative patterns are examined to trace changes in usage and complexity across proficiency levels. To evaluate how literary sophistication develops, the study conducts both intra-language within English and within Spanish and inter-language between English and Spanish comparisons. This allows for an assessment of alignment or divergence in the strategies used to introduce literary elements across the two languages. Beginning with English similes. First, for levels 1 and 2, approximately an A2, they show a very low frequency of literary similes. Although like and as occurred frequently, they were almost always used in grammatical or idiomatic context. For example, look like as well as, not as literary similes. There were no real literary similes present at this stage. This reflects that the text focused on functional, straightforward language with minimal figurative complexity. For the levels 3 and 4, approximately a B1, authentic literary similes began to emerge, though still sporadically. Among them were examples such as she was crying like a baby and he ran as fast as a cheetah. These are basic, commonly used comparisons indicative of an early incorporation of figurative language. The similes are cliched and culturally familiar, serving to introduce learners to figurative thinking without demanding complex interpretation. For the fifth and sixth level, approximately a B2, we find a higher density and greater variety of similes. Notable examples include the wind lashed the trees like a whip, or she was as silent as the grave, and it felt like walking on air. These comparisons reflect more vivid imagery, emotional layering, and some creativity beyond stock phrases. The B2 level texts offer greater contextual and stylistic nuance, using similes to enhance mood, description, and narrative tone, hallmarks of a higher literary register. Continuing with the Spanish similes, at the Nivel 1, A2 presented an even starker absence of literary similes. Uses of como were almost exclusively grammatical or occupational, for example, trabaja como médico, while cual was not used in any simile capacity. This suggests an even more conservative approach than English at the beginner level. Next, at the Nivel 2, B1, a slight emergence of formulaic similes is visible. Corpus hits include corrió como el viento and brillaba como el sol. Expressions that are both commonly known and often memorized, possibly appearing in idiomatic or poetic forms even outside literary text. These comparisons, while recognizable, lack originality and remain functionally descriptive rather than stylistically inventive. For the third level, B2, the presence of similes becomes notably more frequent and richer. Confirmed examples, such as gritaba como un loco and the more poetic tenía los ojos como dos luceros, show an increased focus on emotional expression, metaphorical description, and vivid visual imagery. While como dominates in simile formation, cual remains almost entirely absent, suggesting it is far less productive in modern or learner-directed literary Spanish. The figurative language at this level becomes more effective in building narrative tone and emotional resonance. Continuing with personification. In English, it is rare at levels 1 and 2 with barely any examples, but more frequent in levels 3 and 4, though still subtle. For example, the moon watched him walk away, and very present in levels 5 and 6. Her soul found a home with God. Therefore, there is a clear progression with language at each level, with B2 text showing creative personification. In Spanish, rather, it is absent or minimal in levels 1 and 2, the same, and appears in nivel 3, used with some subtlety. For example, con sus ojos guasones, con sus ojos dulces, still less common than in English B2, though. So therefore, it is found only at higher levels, slightly less frequent than in English. Continuing with hyperbole, in English, it appears already at level 3 and continues through 4 to 6. Examples at level 4, for example, the world will forget about you completely, while at level 6, a horror at the huge emptiness of space. Often humorous or emotional exaggeration becomes richer in B2, while in Spanish it is rare at nivel 1 y 2, but especially common with enorme, and appears more clearly at nivel 3. Example, todo lo alcanzaba con su enorme entusiasmo vital, less idiomatic than English and often more literal exaggeration. That said, it is very important to note that in the course of my research, I initially intended to explore metaphors and metaphoric language. However, I found that analyzing them using a corpus based approach was impossible due to the nuanced and context dependent nature of metaphors. As a result, a different methodological framework would be necessary to effectively study this aspect of language. And therefore, we will move on to the discussions. Now, the analysis reveals a clear progression in the use of literary devices across proficiency levels in both English and Spanish graded readers, reflecting how linguistic and stylistic complexity is scaffolded in learner materials. Similarly stood out as the most accessible and frequently used figures of speech, appearing in more diverse and creative forms in English text as early as the B1 level and becoming significantly richer at B2. In contrast, Spanish similes were introduced later and remained formulaic, relying predominantly on como, with cual virtually absent as a literary connector. This suggests differences not only in the structure of the two languages, but also in the pedagogical strategies applied to literary exposure. Moreover, other devices such as personification and hyperbole followed similar trajectories. English text showed earlier and more expressive use, particularly by B2, where learners encountered metaphorically nuanced expressions that contributed to tone, mood, and characterization. In Spanish, these devices appeared later and were more restrained in style, pointing to a tendency towards simpler narrative expressions in lower level text. The disparity could be attributed to cultural and editorial factors, as well as differing assumptions about learner readiness for figurative language. Finally, a further notable pattern was the abundance of false positives, especially in early levels. Terms like as and como frequently appeared in grammatical rather than literary roles, suggesting a stage approach in which learners first encounter these forms functionally before engaging with them stylistically. This supports the idea that literary language is not introduced haphazardly, but is instead gradually layered into text once a foundation of literary comprehension has been established. Together, these observations highlight how literary elements are progressively woven into language learning materials, with English readers tending to offer earlier and richer exposures to figurative forms. The slow integration of these features in Spanish may reflect a more cautious or conservative pedagogical model, potentially limiting opportunities for learners to develop literary competence alongside linguistic fluency. Finally, ending with the conclusions, this study confirms that both English and Spanish graded readers demonstrate a progression in literary complexity from A2 to B2 levels. However, the pace and richness of that progression differs substantially between the two languages. English graded readers introduce literary devices earlier and with greater variety, offering learners increased engagement with similes, personification, and hyperbole as they advance. Spanish readers, by contrast, tend to delay and simplify these features, which may result in less exposure to the expressive potential of the language. And finally, these findings suggest that English learners are, in general, better prepared for the stylistic and interpretative challenges of authentic literary text by the end of the B2 level. Spanish learners, while still progressing in linguistic accuracy and comprehension, may benefit from more deliberate integration of figurative language earlier in the reading journey. Overall, this comparative analysis highlights the importance of not only grammatical and lexical development in L2 instruction, but also of carefully scaffolding literary competence, especially if learners are to become fully proficient readers of real world text in their target language. And finally, thank you for listening.